So this is the third day, and I would like to begin today by first talk about East-West studies, even though this may be something that would be less related to in Brazil, but I think some of the issues are the same, because Brazil, China, even though you are in the south, we're in the east, we're not in the center. So in that sense, many of the issues might be the same. East-West studies, of course, by that, first of all, the name has to be defined. East-West, because the Earth is actually round. There's no absolute east or absolute west.
Yeah.
It's only, well, the medium, of course, is in London, the Greenwich time. That's because the British first decided, therefore, whatever is east of that is called east and what is west. But if you go east and go east all the time, and then you come back to the same point. So in that sense, whatever is called east and west is relative. It's kind of convenient. For the convenience sake, we use terms like that. And also, when we say east and west, also it's problematic. What is the east? Because in my case, for example, I often talk about China, but China is one of the eastern countries in Far East. East includes much more. Even in Far East or East Asia, you have Japan, you have Korea, you have Vietnam, you have China. This is called the East. So it's very, you have to be conscious when you talk about East. You mean, for the convenience sake, I was talking about one of the Eastern cultures. But of course, East also you should be including Southeast, like India, or Southwest. Southeastern Asia, for example, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, all this is the eastern countries. So in that sense, the kind of representation is always limited. So we have to, given all these allowances to the terms we use. The same is true with West. What is West? The West is British, or even in Britain you have England and Scotland. Scottish are very different from English. And then the French and German are all very different. French and German, I often use the example of Heinrich Heine, a poet and a writer I love very much. He's a Jewish writer, and he wrote his wonderful book called The History of German Philosophy and Religion, which was written in response to Madame Sterlet, the very famous book that on Germany. And I often quoted this passage in Heine's preface to the book. He said, recently the French have translated some of our best works of German literature, and they thought they understand German literature. But they are just the beginning, from the total ignorance to the beginning of understanding. And he said, without understanding the history of German philosophy and religion, our best works would remain silent flowers to the French. So you can see that even the French and the German, we think are all very major Western European traditions. They're actually very, very different. Of course, in languages are different. I mean, French is a Romance language, and German is a Teutonic language, come from different linguistic families. So there are many differences. So even when we say West, is also problematic. So when we say East-West study, I still use the term, because after all, we have to use terms to indicate a region, a culture, a tradition, which always is plural, always is diverse. So given that understanding, then we can use words like East and West studies. Do not just take East as very literally all the Eastern countries. Now, if you think of the history of comparative literature as started in the 19th century, it's impossible to have East-West studies, because as we talked about, for the last 2 days, the beginning of 19th century, beginning of comparative literature, had this already from the very beginning to have this rigorous requirement of working with original languages. So it's, in a way, it's logical and reasonable to require European comparatists to know European languages. That's the idea of the Decaclitismus, the 10 languages which are all European. And it's very difficult to cross the boundary from Europe to non-Europe, to have both understanding of Western culture, European literature, and also non-European literature. It's very, very difficult. But that's the idea that we should strive for, particularly in world literature. So that's why when we talk about world literature, sooner or later, we'll always go to the initial moment when Goethe was talking about world literature, when he was reading a Chinese novel in translation. So there are two things. World literature from the very beginning, when Goethe talks about, it's already not a European tradition. Goethe, of course, was, as German, in the early 19th century, is understandable, because Germany was not a unified country at that time. There are many different principalities. Bavaria would be different from southern Germany, from Alsace and Lorraine, that region, and northern would be very, very different. So Germany is not a unified country at that time. So in a way, for Goethe, it's understandable that he didn't really have what we call national tradition as such. The only thing that unified Germany at that time maybe was the German language. Since Luther's translation of the Bible, German language was unified all the German-speaking people, but politically they were divided in different places. Goethe was, of course, very important for Weimar Republic, but that's not the whole of Germany. So for Goethe, because of this, I think he had much more sort of what I would like to call a cosmopolitan perspective, taking the world into purview, not just the German or European tradition. As we know that he was very interested in non-European literature, even though he considered himself as an inheritor of the Greek tradition, a classical tradition. But he was interested, for example, the Indian play Sakuntala, very famous play by Kalidasa, a very old Indian play. He was also interested in the Persian poet Hafiz. Hafiz had many sort of ghazal, very small form of poetry that influenced Goethe's own East-West divan. He had a collection of poems writing about East and West. So Goethe was a different person in a way, very different from many other European writers and scholars of his time. So for Goethe, he was talking about East-West. But for really 19th century, as a discipline, comparative literature was really restricted to Europe. And therefore, for 19th century and much of 20th century, it's very difficult to talk about East-West studies. It's only, I think, in the very last decade of the 20th century, in the 1990s, I think people like me would be taken serious. Well, I don't know whether it's taken seriously, but more serious than before. And before, nobody would pay attention. You do East-West studies, could you do it? Who would do that? How can you do that? In fact, there was a very, talking about my personal experience, in 2005, I published a book with Cornell University Press, which I consider one of my important works. It's called Allegoresis, Reading Canonical Literature East and West, which basically was discussing the idea of allegorical interpretation, which started with the Greek tradition, the Homer, because Homer was considered a canonical work for the ancient Greeks. Homer was much earlier, 10th century already, had very sort of established Homeric epics. But by the 5th century BC, when philosophers came into the scene, became the so-called quarrel between philosophy and poetry. And Plato, as a philosopher, of course on the side of philosophy, saying that, even though I like Homer, but I would not allow any poets in the Republic. When he was, in Book 10 in Republic, he was talking about poetry as imitating the natural world, which already, for Plato, the true world is a world of ideas. The natural world we feel, we can touch, is a shadow of that idea, a world of ideas. And poets and writers, painters, or the artists imitating the natural world or phenomenal world is, creating a shadow of a shadow. Therefore, he says it's 3 times away, moved from truth. So poetry is no truth, it's fiction, it's telling lies. And poetry also watering our emotions, feelings, rather than cultivate our rationality. And that's the 2 reasons that Plato wanted to get rid of poets in his Republic. And that, of course, was the quarrel between poetry and philosophy. And Homer was threatened to be decanonized at that time. And therefore, there were philosophers who come to the defense of Homer, and particularly the sophists, would say Homer's texts actually contained profound meaning, which was completely different from the literal sense of the text. Of course, if you read Homer's epics or read the whole of Greek mythology, that's what Plato and other philosophers was blaming poets for. They make the gods and goddesses behave like human beings, a very bad behavior also. I mean, think of Zeus. How many affairs he had outside his marriage with Hera? How many illegitimate children he produced, including Hercules, the greatest Greek hero, was not actually born by marriage with Hera. So there are many stories, which is very famous stories, but really showing the kind of human limitations. In that sense, Greek gods and goddesses are just like us. It's just more like Feuerbach's argument. The God is created in the image of man, actually, rather than we are created in the image of God. The Greek gods are indeed like that, and there are wonderful stories. The stories like the Golden Apple, the Judgment of Paris, the 3 goddesses trying to bribe Paris. So Hera says, if you give me the Golden Apple, I make you the most powerful king on earth. And then Athena, as goddess of wisdom, saying, if you give me the Golden Apple, I make you the wisest person on earth, maybe a professor. Not very attractive. And of course, Aphrodite says, if you give me the Golden Apple, I make the most beautiful woman to be your wife. And Paris says, yes, of course. That's how he got married. The problem is that Helen was already married. And of course, goddess of love and beauty, Aphrodite, helped Helen to fall in love with Paris and eloped with Paris, and that's the start of the Trojan War. That's Homer's epic. So how can these stories be the paragon of virtue? I mean, gods and goddesses are supposed to teach us all the good virtues and moral, perfection. And all the stories, they're trying to cheat on each other, try to fight on each other. I mean, the only difference is that gods never die, But they are, the Trojan War, they're fighting on both sides. Hera was on the side of the Greeks, and Aphrodite was on the side of the Trojans, So that became a problem when poetry and philosophy started to, and actually that's a reflection of the rise of philosophy in 5th century BC. I mean, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates became so important. And therefore they attacked the authority of the poets, particularly Homer, as a representative of the poets. Thank you. So the sophists came up with the defense, the idea of allegory. So the concept of allegory was born in defense of the canonicity of Homer. I want to keep Homer as important as before, because Homer was read not as literature for the Greeks, was the book for education for the young people. So the sophists argued Homer's text has 2 layers of meaning. On the literal level, it's telling the story about gods and goddesses and fighting and all that, but actually it has a higher level of meaning, which is beyond the literal sense. It's an allegorical meaning. Allegory, of course, in Greek means to speak of different things. Saying one thing and meaning another. This is the definition of allegory. And that definition was very quickly used to read any other important canonical works. In the Hellenistic period, Philo of Alexandria used the allegorical reading to apply to the reading of the Jewish Bible. He was Jew, but this Hellenistic Jew, he knew all the great works of Greek culture. And compared with Greek culture, indeed, the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament, was too simple, actually. And this is very important to think of. Auerbach began by comparing Homer and the Bible and the first chapter in the Mimesis. Indeed, they represent two very different styles or types or modes of writing, of representation. The biblical was so simple. I mean, can you imagine the creation of the earth when God says, "Let there be light," and there was light, 2 lines. Homer would have 1,000 lines to describe how wonderful, you know. Homer is fully externalized, but the Bible leaves a lot of things unsaid. So, indeed, to defend the Bible is also important. Remember, even St. Augustine, when he wrote his Confessions, he was educated as a scholar and was very familiar with Greek classics. And compared with Greek classics, the Bible was, let's face it, a very simple book. And therefore, a very important book written by Augustine, I think it's very, very important for literary theory, is on Christian doctrine, in which he says, the Bible have 2 kinds of texts. One is very simple, very directly tell you what is truth of God. And there are also very obscure parts, very deliberately obscure parts, because he said the Holy Ghost, the Holy Spirit, appropriately understood that there are 2 kinds of readers, in particular in his time, the Hellenistic time. There are people who are hungry for truth. They want to get truth as quick as possible. So the simple part of the Bible telling you what the truth is. But there are also sort of educated people by this Greek tradition. They always try to find deeper meanings. They don't want to read the simple text. They're accustomed to read texts that are much more complicated, much more obscure. Therefore, the obscure parts of the Bible is for those people. Otherwise, they would look down on the Bible, say this is too simple a book. So you have 2 parts, but very importantly, they said whatever the difficult, the obscure part of the Bible says is already said very clearly in the literal sense of the Bible. And that becomes a very important beginning of the interpretation, which I probably will talk about later. So the allegorical tradition, allegorical interpretation, came as defense of Bible, of Homer, was used by Philo of Alexandria to read the Old Testament. And then, of course, later in the Christian tradition, that became a very important reading methodology. From the Christian point of view, of course, the Jewish Bible, they have to have Old Testament because the Christians were Jews first. The only difference is that Christians accepted Jesus, the Jews didn't. But before the 2nd century, actually, all the Christians were Jews. So the sect separating from the Jewish Hebraic tradition, accepting Jesus as the Messiah. By the 2nd century, that is when the Gospel of, I can't remember if it's Zhang or one of the 4 Gospels were written, was already the time that the Christians had already break away from the ethnic bond. Because Jewish religion is Jewish religion. You have to be a Jew, to be the chosen people. But Christians do not have that limitation. Whoever accepts just Jesus as God, you become a Christian. I mean, you're named after Christ, Jesus Christ. You're called a Christian because you believe in Christ. So did not have that limitation of an ethnic origin. So by the 2nd century, Christians became much, much larger, and under the Roman Empire was a much, much larger group because it didn't have this ethnic or racial denomination. And they converted a lot of people, particularly poor people in Roman Empire. So the Christianity was the poor people's religion because, there are a lot of ideas was actually primitive communist ideas. That is, no private ownership of properties. It's all shared by the community and all devote everything to Christ and so on. But when the Christianity became an official sanctioned religion under Constantine the emperor, Then the interpretation of the Bible, you have to deal with the two sections, the Old Testament and New Testament. How do you read from a Christian point of view the Old Testament? Old Testament, of course, for the Jews are their history. You know, there are books on the kings and tell all the lineage of the different families and so on. A history for Jews. But for Christians, there is a tendency to read this as not really history, but symbols. So what in Christian reading is called the typological reading. That is, read everything in the Old Testament as a type, as a prototype of the coming of Christ. A very interesting example I can give you is the interpretation of the story of Abraham and Isaac.
Of course, yeah.
That's a wonderful passage. Abraham is such a good man, so devoted to God, and God try to test him and say, well, when he was going on the road, and suddenly the bush is on fire, caught his attention, and he hear the voice of angels talking to him from the bush, the burning bush, and saying, God asks you to sacrifice your son. No questions asked. Abraham lead Isaac to the mountain and asked Isaac to collect wood and carry this and build the altar to kill him. I mean, it's not very fair. But anyway, Abraham is so devoted to God that has no doubt whatsoever to kill his son. So, of course, we all know that when he really cut his son, then it's a lamb, or it's a deer, I cannot remember exactly. But Isaac is not harmed. And then the angel says, actually, God is testing you, and you're such a good man. So that proves your piety and your devotion to God. So that is the Old Testament story. And for the Jews, that is really Abraham, of course, is the main protagonist in the story. The story is all about Abraham, how good he is, how devoted he is to God. Now, from a Christian point of view, the interpretation is different. The figure is not Abraham, but Isaac. Why? Because Isaac is Abraham's only son, just like Christ was the only son of God. Abraham carried the woods to the place to build the altar, just like Christ carried the cross to Golgotha, where he was crucified. So Isaac became the prototype of Christ. So you find the perfect example of how you read the Old Testament from the Christian point of view, which was, of course, from Jews' point of view, was totally different. I mean, this is before Christ, the Jewish Old Testament. So this is an example of the sort of allegorical, typological interpretation of the Old Testament from the Christian point of view. But for me, the most interesting, this is what I discuss in my book, and that's why it's East-West Comparative Study. Because I was, in China, I read the Bible during the Cultural Revolution. I miraculously found a copy of the authorized version, the King James Bible. And the language is so beautiful, and it's very, very important for my learning of English. I basically taught myself English, and reading the Bible was very important. And when I first read the Bible, I was shocked to find the Song of Solomon. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Song of Solomon.
Yes.
When I read the Song of Solomon, I was shocked because every other book in the Bible was always talking about God, about how you devote to God, you fear God, you walk in the shadow of God, everything. But the Song of Solomon never mentioned the name of God once, not even once. And the poem is really a beautiful poem. It's so erotic, basically describing a woman's body from head to toe. And there's famous lines to say her two breasts, and you lay your right hand under me, and your left hand embrace me, and so describing lovemaking, describing how she is waiting for her lover to come, and how the describe her body from every part. I mean, her navel, for example, beautiful navel, her ankle, her dance, and so on. I was so surprised to find this. What is this Song of Solomon doing in the Bible? I mean, that became a problem even for me for interpretation. How do you interpret the Song of Solomon in the Bible? Of course, I didn't know anything when I was in China, but when I went to Harvard, I took a wonderful course, a seminar with James Kugel. He's a wonderful scholar. And he has a course on Bible and criticism. And he, at the very first, he said, don't think Bible and criticism is reading Bible like a literary work. No, Bible is the book. For ancient and for medieval time and even for early modern time, reading the Bible was the model of reading all other texts, which is very important. Indeed, we can think of Dante in the 14th century, 13th century. And we know that Dante didn't call his work Divine Comedy. He called it Commedia. Never called it Divine. Divine is later added by some critics when he was, canonized. And we also know, this is controversial, whether it's true or not, but authentic or not, but Dante has a letter to the Grand Duke of Scala, Grand Scala, to explain how to read his own work. And he claimed his work, his Commedia, has 4 levels of meaning. The literal, the moral, the allegorical, and the allegorical. For 13th century, that was quite a big claim, because that's the way you read the Bible. Who are you? I mean, Dante is a human poet. You say your text is just like the Bible at 4 levels of meaning. It's quite outrageous, actually. But that was very important for Dante criticism. But many people were saying it was maybe not authentic. But I think that most people came to the consensus that was written by Dante, even though that doesn't solve the problem that that's the best way of reading Divine Comedy, of course not. But that was already the time that you have the concept that Bible has 4 different levels of meaning, and one of these was allegorical. Allegorical means that the meaning is far beyond the literal sense. And that is the way that traditionally the Song of Solomon was read. Because the Song of Solomon was a problem for the Jewish rabbis before the Christians. In the 1st century, there was a council at Germania, and the Jewish rabbis were debating whether the Song of Solomon and the Ecclesiastes, the book of the preacher, should be included in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible. Because these 2 books, when you read these 2 texts, this happen to be the most beautiful of the Old Testament. The Song of Solomon is a beautiful, beautiful erotic poem. And the Ecclesiastes is a philosophical poem that expresses something that is very, very interesting, or even tragic, because it begins by vanities, vanities, always vanities, right? It's kind of a nihilistic view. It's very different from the Christian theological point of view, that everything is in control by God and so on. So that these 2 books were debated even by the rabbis in the 1st century. But very famously, Rabbi Akiba, is a very famous rabbi, very influential, he said, the day Israel is given the Song of Solomon is the holy of holiest. So in other words, he must have understood the Song of Solomon in an allegorical way, because people were debating why, you talk about the women and her breasts and all this love, and what has this got to do with our religion? But he was saying the Song of Solomon is most holy. Therefore, he was understanding the Song of Solomon, and then when I went to Harvard reading this and taking the course with James Kugel, I really spent much more time than the other graduate students, because I was interested. I didn't know anything, so I went to the library, the Andover Library, which is of the Divinity School at Harvard. Has a wonderful collection. And I read the whole 5 volumes of Sansino translation into English. Of course, I couldn't read in Hebrew. All the Midrash Rabbah, Midrash, the rabbinic interpretation of the Bible. And the Midrash Rabbah on the Song of Solomon was fascinating. For example, I mentioned the 2 breasts, which is very graphic. The problem with this is that you often think of the poem or the book in literary sense is describing a woman, her beauty and so on. That's great, but not religious. The rabbis say when the Song of Solomon mentioned the two breasts, and the Rabbah says, the Midrash Rabbah says, just like the two breasts are the beauty of a woman's body, Abraham and Moses are the beauty of Israel. So the two breasts have nothing to do with a woman. It's all talking about Abraham and Moses. And then, of course, you understand the book was talking about man and a woman in love. No, it's God and Israel. So the lover is God, and the woman, pining for the coming of her lover is Israel. So Israel is in love with God, and indeed, in ancient religion, in India, for example, some of the erotic images and poems are indeed holy texts, a kind of symbolic representation of the union with God. Even though you have, I don't know whether you have seen some of the, for example, in Tibet, Tibetan Buddhism often have a sculpture with a man and a woman have intercourse. That is supposed to be the indication of union with God, so with Buddha. So in different religions, in India, in South Asia, you do have this tradition. So that had something to do maybe with the biblical, the Jewish, the Hebraic tradition of using sexual love to symbolize religious feelings. And this is, of course, in medieval European literature, you also find poems like that. So it's fascinating stuff. But then in the Christian interpretation, particularly origin of the, I think he's 3rd century, he's the most allegorical of all the church fathers. I read a lot of kind of Christian interpretation. I become much more a Christian interpreter than many of the priests, actually. I tell you the joke. I was teaching in California. I'm not a religious person, I don't go to church, but the local church, the Chinese church actually, the priests want to convert me. I want to go to his church. I said I'm not interested. But he said, can I see you in my office? I said, of course, anybody can come to my office. And he came and he wanted to convert her. But after 5 minutes, I find I can convert him. because for a particular passage of the Bible, he knew nothing of the historical interpretations. He knew only the current church position to tell you how to interpret this passage. But I tell you, when Augustine read this, what he said, when Thomas Aquinas read this, what he said, he had no clue of this. I said, okay, so that's the end of our discussion. Anyway, so for the Christian interpretation, Origen is the most allegorical of the church fathers. Actually, his views was condemned later because going too far, even for the Christian theologians, is too much. So he read but his book was mostly burned, actually, condemned as heretic. But his homilies on the Song of Solomon and his interpretation of the Song of Solomon was preserved in Latin translation and preserved even today as one of the important works for Christian theology. And he took the allegorical position to read the Song of Solomon, and very easily for him to turn the love between God and Israel into God and New Israel. New Israel is Christianity. So it's very easy. So I find this fascinating stuff of basically reading a classical text or a canonical text as meaning something different from the literal sense of the text. Because why? Because when we have a text canonized, we expect the text, particularly in earlier time, not so much in modern time. Modern time people really didn't. But in earlier time, when you canonize a text, the text is supposed to teach us the most important truth, the moral values, the cultural values, so everything you expect from the text. Now, when the text doesn't really bear that responsibility, it's too heavy for it, then you come up with an interpretation, like Homer. Many people say Homer described gods, making them too like humans, and it's not good. Then you have an interpretation to say Homer actually meaning something that's very, very different. It's much higher than what the literal text says. For the Bible, for the Song of Solomon, that's exactly the same case. Philo already read it from an allegorical point of view, and the Jewish rabbis already read it from the allegorical point of view, and the Christian writers, particularly Origen, also read this from the allegorical point of view. So this is West tradition. West, of course, including even the Jewish, as important for the Western tradition. And then I look at this. In China, you find the Confucian classics, which were, again, canonical texts, are supposed to be the textbooks for education of young people. All scholars would read the Confucian classics. And the earliest one of the, one of the earliest Confucian classics is called Shi Jing, or the Book of Poetry, which including different parts of poetry, and the first part is called Airs of the States. Airs in the sense of folk songs. Supposedly they are collected from different states, preaching more than 3,000 years ago. As I mentioned, I think yesterday, in China there's a concept that the folk songs or poems will reflect. I mentioned Confucius talking about different function of poetry. One is observing the condition. If you collect some folk songs, if the people are happy, they'll have happy sounds. If people living in a bad time, they'll complain. So the songs will reflect the condition of society of the time. So in the first part of the Confucian classic of Book of Poetry, there altogether are more than 300 poems. And the first part were supposed to be folk songs collected from different parts, different states of ancient time. And many of those are love songs. Obviously, when people want to sing, they always sing about love because that's the most powerful emotion people have. As human beings, it's very natural. I don't think any literature, if there's any literature that doesn't have love, it's probably not worth reading. And of course, in China, the Book of Poetry as Confucian classic contains many love songs, and that became a problem for some of. I don't know why in ancient time all the, maybe not dead, dead not just white males, but also Chinese males, they have problem with eroticism. When they have a poem that talks about love, they always have a problem. I don't know why. I don't understand why. For our modern concept, what's wrong with that? It's not really pornographic. It's not graphic description of love making. It's just a express, longing of love and so on. So the very first poem in the classic begins with this. Quan quan is the sound of the birds. Quan quan, the birds sing on a small island. And then there is a young woman. Okay, let me first think of the Chinese text. I remember. 关关雎鸠，在河之洲。窈窕淑女，君子好逑。So Quan Quan sung the birds on a small island. They are on a small island, and then 窈窕淑女, a very beautiful young lady. 君子好逑, the young man want to woo her. So that's the beginning, this first stanza of this poem. So then continues to describe the young man. He always thinks of her, but cannot get her. So he cannot sleep. He overturned this way and that way during his sleeps and couldn't go to sleep. And that's basically the poem. The poem ends happily that he finally, gets her, and he's having a team of people beating drums and have gongs and going to marry her. That's the end of the poem. So that's very innocuous. But then the Confucian commentators try to make this poem mean much, much more than what it literally says. Literally says basically you can think of this as a simple poem of a man in love with a woman trying to get her. That's all. But the commentators are saying no. This is about the queen of King Wen in ancient time. She is so virtuous. She's not envious of the king trying to get good ministers and good scholars to serve in his court. Have nothing to do with the poem. How can that be? So many of these poems that has some So not erotic, some suggestion of love is always read over, minimize the possible erotic element. And to read, to impose a very heavy layer of moral and political reading, to say all this is about moral virtues, and King Wen is always the best figure. I mean, for Confucius, King Wen is a perfect ruler of the ancient time, and if anything touched by King Wen is like touched by magic, and everything becomes good, becomes perfect. So that's the way to read the book of poetry. And traditionally, the book of poetry is never just read by itself. It's always prefaced by a small preface. And a small preface was produced by Han Dynasty commentators, basically in the first before and first century after BC and AD. So Han Dynasty commentators would always impose a strong moral political reading to a poem that looks like a love poem. Sometimes becomes ridiculously far-fetched. There is one poem I can tell you is very, very nice, very small, just 2 stanzas. The first says, "Oh, you mad boy, you do not want to eat with me, and because of that I cannot eat, I cannot sleep." The second stanza basically repeating, just like many folk songs, repeating lines, "Oh, you crazy boy, because you cannot, you don't want to talk to me, and therefore cannot sleep, I cannot eat," and so on. So that's the 2 stanzas. So when you read the text, you naturally you come up with this idea. This must be a woman, a young woman, is complaining about her lover, and she calls him a crazy boy, 狂童 actually, a crazy boy, because you don't want to talk with me, you don't want to eat with me, I cannot sleep, I cannot talk, and so on. So she is, in love, and so this is a poem about complaining about the unfaithful lover. No, the commentators tell you that have nothing to do with this, and they quote a historical incident and to say this is a poem actually not written by a woman but written by a minister. The good minister is not trusted by his king. His king doesn't want to talk to him. Therefore, he was complaining, "Oh, you do not talk to me. You don't, do not. So I cannot eat. I cannot sleep because he's so concerned about the fate of the country." That's the meaning of the poem. What a killjoy! But that's how the commentary tradition read the Confucian classic. There are, of course, beautiful love poems in China. Nobody cared about to read them allegorically. But because the book of poetry was considered a Confucian classic, was so important for all scholars to read and for examinations based on this. For thousands of years, Chinese examination system is all based on your reading of Confucian classics. So you have to understand correctly. And the commentators will lead you to understand the poems not as erotic poems, love poems, but all about morality and politics. So I find that's fascinating. I mean, this is very much like the Jewish rabbis and the Christian theologians, the church fathers, read the Song of Solomon. Right? They're all reading the text as though the text is saying something completely different from what actually literally says. When the poem says, the beauty of the 2 breasts. No, this has nothing to do with breasts. Abraham and Moses. So that's the way, because this is a canonical text that has heavy responsibility to teach us moral virtue, teach us truths, teach us religious truths and whatever. So when you have this canonization, then the canonicity of the text has to be defended. Otherwise, they will be destroyed and say, well, just like Homer, what is this nonsense about gods and goddesses cheating on each other? I mean, they should get rid of this. And that's also the question that, as I mentioned in the Council of Gemini, some of the rabbis were trying to get rid of Song of Solomon and the Book of Preacher. And the defense of the canonicity of the text is allegorical interpretation. So allegorical interpretation, on the one hand, to our modern point of view, is really far-fetched, ridiculous reading of the text, distortion of the text. But on the other hand, it's precisely for those texts can survive, can be preserved. So we have to thank those allegorizers. Thank you. Otherwise, Homer or the book of poetry would be destroyed long time ago. So you see, when I say East-West studies, I'm not necessarily say, there are completely identical ways of reading or very similar. They are similar, but the comparison is based on this theoretical issue of canonicity and defense of canonicity, defense of poetry. When Plato blamed Homer, blamed all the Greek poets to say that poets are liars, they don't tell truth, and so on. Of course, beginning with Aristotle, we have this long tradition in the West of the defense of poetry, or sometimes called apology of poetry, because Aristotle didn't accept the sort of dualism in Plato. For Aristotle, the phenomenal world is the true world. Therefore, imitation of the phenomenal world is valuable. For Plato, the only truth is the ideas, which is abstract. But of course, he has a point. He says, we have tables like this, but table can be of different shape, different color, different material. Can be made of wood, plastic, metal, whatever. But table as one concept is the idea of table. So it's kind of an abstraction of all the phenomenal world, phenomenon. Indeed, language like that. When we have a concept of human, who's human? We are all individuals. We cannot be the whole of humanity, but it's very important to have a concept of human, right? Or animal, or any of this. So most of the words we use are actually abstract concepts, summarized of certain qualities of many, many things and summarized as one. So it's important. So Plato has his point, but then because of this, he tried to, debase all the poetic representations, because literature and poetry, of course, is particular. You're not talking about abstract table. Who cares about abstract table? You always describe, Homer uses thousands of lines to describe the shield of Achilles. Just one shield. He would use thousands of lines to describe how wonderful the shield also is an indication of the history of Greek and so on. And of course, in imitation, Virgil's Aeneid also have a long book describing Aeneas' shield that basically tells the whole history of Rome. So all this, is very particular. So Plato put down poetry, but Aristotle doesn't. At least in his Poetics, we know that he argues poetry is higher than history, because history represents what actually happens, therefore tells what is. But poetry can tell you what might be, the probability, rather than the reality. So reality is limited by actuality, but probability is higher because it's more philosophical. So therefore argues history is limited, poetry is higher than history because it is more philosophical. So beginning with Aristotle's Poetics is already the defense of poetry. And of course later in different traditions you all has the argument for defense of poetry. Philip Sidney in English in 16th century is very famous for his apology or defense of poetry. And he turns it around. He says poets never say they are telling the truth, right? They are always making something up. But other than history is limited, philosophers can give you a wordy description. The poet give you a beautiful image and picture, so you understand truth even better. So he has this famous idea coming from Horace that poetry teaches and delights. Not only teach you truth, but really teaching a pleasant way, so reader would be very easy to accept the truth that poets teach. So there are many, many arguments for the defense of poetry. And of course, in 19th century, my favorite is Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde always says things counterintuitive and always make better sense. A very wonderful essay by Oscar Wilde is called Decay of Lying. By lying, he says, to tell beautiful and untrue things is poetry. So basically, poetry is lying, but it's a beautiful lie, and has a very, very different way So he turns Plato on his head, basically, reverse the argument to say poets are wonderful because they are telling us untrue but beautiful things. I'm sorry, I have to drink more water. So for me, when I do the comparative studies, I often start with a theoretical issue, a question, like the question of allegorical interpretation. Why allegory arises? Because it's defense of canonicity. You find the same way of commentary of reading, even though very different in detail, but in response to the same question. You find it in very different traditions, the West and in China. All try to read the canonical text as though the text says something quite different from what actually literally is said. So this is one of my arguments about East and West. This is one of the books I wrote. The first book I wrote, actually, I mentioned it yesterday about Derrida and my critique of logocentrism, was actually later became the first book I published in English. It's called Tao and Logos, because logos in Greek means both speaking and what is spoken. In China, Tao means both the philosophical idea of Tao, but also means to speak. Really by, uncanny coincidence, Greek and Chinese, two different languages, all have the same kind of word, the two meanings in the same word. Speaking and thinking, and the duality of thinking and speak in the same word. This is what Derrida criticizes as logocentrism. But in China, you find the same kind of logocentrism. It's not called logocentrism, but very much in the Chinese tradition, particularly in Taoist writings. I talked about how, philosophers in Taoist tradition, Lao Tzu, in particular Zhang, I talked about the story of the wheelwright making wheel in front of the hall of the Duke, and was talking about Duke reading something that's meaningless, dregs of the ancients, and so on. It's all putting down writing. All have this metaphysical hierarchy of thinking, speech, and writing. So you find the same kind of phenomenon coming out of the same concern. Basically, the concern is this, that we all have to use language. I think that's universally human. All humans have language, and in fact, language is the definition of human. Aristotle says, human beings, the defining of human beings is that human beings are animals with logos. Of course, traditionally, logos is understood as reason. So the translation, the Latin translation is animal rationalum. So it's rational animal is a human being. But Heidegger and particularly Gadamer all argue logos also means language. So what Aristotle was talking about is that human being is the animal that with language. Now, we always now, in modern time, we know that maybe animals also have their language. I mean, they have communicated with each other. But Gadamer has a wonderful essay called Man and Language. It talks about the difference between human language and other, maybe lower kind of languages. Human language is the language that can formulate ideas about the future. So language is not just talking about this moment, because animals can respond to each other. If there's threat, let's say a group of deers, and suddenly there's a lion coming in, and then deers will make some sound and they will all run away. So respond to some immediate threat. If some food is there, they all come to get the food. So animals can make that kind of communication, use their kind of sound as language. But human beings can conceive the future, can say something about the future, not the present. So you can say something that will happen in the future and direct people to go to that direction. And human beings also can have abstract concepts, have ideas about emotions. So human beings can use language, abuse language, to call your names and you become angry. And actually you don't have to do anything. You don't have to physically beat somebody. You can make somebody very angry by calling names, right? So that's very special about human language. So language is very, very important. So all human communities will have language, and then language are always considered inadequate. So the poets, the philosophers, particularly mystics in religion, always think God is ineffable. The moment of communing with God is always something you cannot express in language. It's something you can maybe intuitively understood, you can feel, but you cannot say it. This is what Wittgenstein talked about in Tractatus Philosophicus, Logico Philosophicus, that this is unsayable at the moment. And many of the mystics, Meister Eckhart is a very famous medieval mystic, would always say that the understanding of God is ineffable. You cannot talk about it, you cannot speak. This is very, very true of mystics, of philosophers. I mentioned Plato's 7th philosophical letters talking about that. You cannot put in language, particularly not in writing, what you have rationally thought. So always like that. And Schiller, Friedrich Schiller, has a beautiful point saying that. How does it go in German? I cannot remember now. Sprich die Seele. Sprich kein Seele mehr. I cannot remember exactly. But basically saying, oh, the soul speaks, but when the soul speaks, it's no longer the soul. So basically, the same idea, So you find that in very different traditions, in Chinese, in Western, so you have the poets also. In China, a wonderful poet, Tang poet, is one of the great poets, Liu Yuxi. He has a line that says that human feelings are so deep that I always hate language so shallow. Language cannot really express the deep emotions. We always say, oh, I'm in love, I cannot, express, and so on. It's very common. Even Shakespeare, the greatest user of language, in his sonnets, in Wen Hao sonnets, he says, my tongue-tied muse. Now, if Shakespeare's muse is tongue-tied, who else can talk? It's a basic question that arises in different traditions. So in my first book on Tao and Logos, I was talking about how poets, how philosophers, how mystics overcome this question of inadequacy of language. So in the Chinese tradition, very powerfully, it's just like the biblical tradition, just like the Jewish Old Testament, Auerbach talked about. You don't say much. You leave a lot of things unsaid. And by suggestive language, you say much more effectively, much more powerfully, to leave the reader, to have the reader's imagination, to fill in the blanks. And in the reader's realization or concretization, this is what Ingarden talks about later. The text only provides a schemata. We always read, when we read a novel, for example, if let's say a novel begins by saying, well, he's drinking a cup of coffee in a coffee place on the table by the street in Paris. Okay, this is the first sentence of a novel. When you read this, you immediately have an image. First of all, how the character looks like, how the coffee shop looks like, how the table looks like, what color. This is not specified. In each reading, you have to have a concretized image. And that is often much richer than what the text can literally say. So indeed, the literary text, even Homeric epics, cannot describe everything. And Homer knew that very well. Because think of Helen, the most beautiful woman that he loved to Troy, the origin of the war of Troy, never was described by Homer. He never said how beautiful she was. The only moment in the Odyssey, or not Odyssey, the Iliad, when Homer described Helen, is indirect. Because they're fighting, a lot of people dead down on the ground, and Helen came up to look at the war because her husband Hector was fighting, and he came up on the top of the citadel. And Homer said, all the elders, the old men were watching too, and say, no wonder people are fighting. That's it. So you know how beautiful she must be. Because all those people see her, oh, that's why. Of course, people are fighting for her. That's worth fighting. But how beautiful she is, how she looks like, what's her color of her eye, her face, how tall she was. No description of her whatsoever. By not describing, you have a much more powerful image in your own imagination how beautiful she is. And it's true, when you think of the great classics, often make bad movies. Many adaptations of great classics into movies are failure. Very few success. Precise for that reason. Because when you read a novel, you have a much richer image and concept. When you look at the actual person, for her, I don't care who is playing Helen, she couldn't be as possibly beautiful as you imagine. So that's the power of language. By precisely not saying, but precisely give you some schemata, suggestion, and the reader, let the reader have full play of the reader's imagination. That's the most powerful way of impression. And that's why, when God says, let there be light, there was light. It's such a powerful sentence. Even in ancient Greek, who was this important person who wrote this tremendous essay and on rhetoric and quoted that as example of powerful expressions. Indeed, the Homeric is a full description, but not really full when it comes to Helen. He didn't say anything. But the Bible, particularly Old Testament, is a very economic way of using language. And the Chinese poetry is like that. Very economically used words. Every word counts. And therefore you don't say, you don't waste your words. Every word has to do something in the poem. And then when you read the poem, then you have a much richer picture or image than you read the description. So that is a way to successfully overcome the problem of inadequacy of language by not saying more, but by saying less. So, the Franco advertisement, small is beautiful, or small, but it's on that principle. Not of course every literature is like that, but indeed in many poems it is like that. By using suggestive language to overcome the problem of inadequacy of expression. So hermeneutics becomes important because all languages, all texts need interpretation, particularly complicated texts, poetic texts, literary texts, or religious texts. Actually, hermeneutics as a concept arises in the interpretation of the Bible. The biblical hermeneutics, biblical exegesis, are the foundation of hermeneutic principles. So when 19th century, when Schleiermacher, the famous German philosopher and a theologian, he himself was a theologian, wrote the first book on general hermeneutics. He said, in the West we have particular hermeneutics. We have the biblical exegesis, how to interpret the Bible. We have the classical philology, how to read the Greek and Roman classics. So we have local hermeneutics, but we don't have a general hermeneutics. So he talks about the general principles of hermeneutics, of course very much influenced by Kant. Because Kant's critical philosophy was really about before we think of something concrete, we think about how to think. So the main schemata in the mind was Kant's philosophical legacy, and which was of course very powerful influence, particularly in German tradition. And Schleiermacher was the first one to talk about the general hermeneutics, the principles of understanding, and so on. And define the task of hermeneutics as to understand first, as well as, and then better than the author himself. So criticism requires a lot of knowledge and scholarship than the author themselves. So that's the definition of a literary scholarship criticism. to require a lot of knowledge, to read a lot of things, to know better than the author himself, so you can have a better understanding. Sometimes even the author himself didn't realize. And that is what we really see. For example, Dante, as I said, had this letter, how to read his work on 4 levels, but it's not the most interesting criticism of Divine Comedy. We have much better ones in 20th century in particular. So when I talk about East-West studies, I think this can be any South-North study, whatever comparative literature we do, is to find, because comparative literature, particularly the new mode of comparative literature in America is called parallelism, parallel studies. In French, in 19th century, it's called influence studies. Because the influence studies of comparative literature, the earlier stage of comparative literature, is very much, as I said, influenced by 19th century positivism. You have to establish real connections between works and authors. You have to study their biography, you study their archives to study who has read what and has been influenced by it. Therefore, is to establish actual factual contact and relations, what the French call the rapport de fait. But as I said, all these tended to be very nationalistic towards the end. The French in particular, because they thought they have the best literature in the world. Therefore, they would like to study how great French writers influenced other lesser literatures. And that became a problem, particularly after the Second World War. In the Second World War, of course, nationalism was considered one of the reasons to have war. The Nazis always thought the Aryan race was the highest, the Jews were just like rats, you can kill them, no problem. So the idea of racism, the idea of nationalism was dismissed after the war. So in post-war world, in America, as a new powerful country, comparative literature studied with a completely new idea. And of course, in addition, many of the great comparatives were Jewish. We talked about Leo Spitzer, Irish Auerbach, Harry Levin, all these are Jewish. And Jews were suffered very badly during the war. So they hated the idea of nationalism,
Yeah.
So they wanted to get rid of national comparisons. Why you want to emphasize your great literature influence on other literature? So René Wenneck has a very sarcastic comment on this kind of study. He said, this is not literary study, this is literary foreign trade. I still owe you so much because you have imported that. So the idea of American idea of comparative studies, parallel study. You don't have to establish 2 authors and the actual connections. And that was liberating. And that is when East-West studies became possible. Because, particularly for China, China had very little contact with Europe before the 20th century. There were some, of course. Marco Polo, after all, in the 13th century came to China, but he was not a literary person. He didn't talk about literature at all. He was a trader. He was basically trading things. And of course, the Jesuit missionaries came to China in late 16th and early 17th century. But that was mainly introducing classics, Confucian classics into Europe, and also introduced European ideas into China. Not much about literature. There were some, but not much. Really, the massive translation of foreign literature in China was the 20th century. So before 20th century, there was nothing, almost very little, to talk about East-West studies. If you want to have real connections, who has read what, But given the American idea of parallel studies, you don't have to have this kind of factual contacts. Comparison can be based on themes, similar ideas, similar themes. For example, the theme about, let's say, love. Who doesn't write about love? Therefore, you can talk. But of course, that becomes a problem. What is the real solid grounds for comparison? Because many poets, writers, write about love, but that is too vague. How do you say, because we all are, therefore it's comparable. Comparison has to go deeper, has to have something more solid, more interesting, and go deeper. And then, very often, it's a theoretical notion, a theme, a thematic study, so it becomes very, very important. So when I do East-West studies, I do not just put Chinese text and European text together to say they're all about love or about whatever. That's not good enough. So it's often a theoretical issue. For example, language, expression, understanding, interpretation. These are universal questions. All traditions, all literatures have the same problem. You all want to have interpretation of the texts to explain why this text means something. The text is, there are different levels of reading a novel or a poem. The lowest level is reading for fun, just, well, it's interesting and read and forgot. And then the higher level, I would say, is appreciation. You try to understand the poem and you appreciate the poem or the novel. And by appreciation, you have to have certain knowledge about the author, about the use of language, about certain techniques and so on. And then there is the interpretation. Interpretation is even higher. That is, you have to know not only the work, but the condition of the work. The historical, the cultural, the philosophical, the religious background. And then talk about the work in relation to this very rich background. Then you have a much better, much deeper understanding of the work than just read the work itself. So in my scale of things, criticism or scholarship comes very high because you have to do a lot of work to interpret the work of literature. You have to understand, as Steinbach says, better than the author himself. And that's not easy. Some authors are very knowledgeable, very learned, but you have to be even more knowledgeable and even more learned. That's quite a lot to ask. But that's what makes scholarship interesting and valuable. If it's something everybody understands, that's not valuable. So in scholarship, in literary studies, it's just like in economics, very simple principle. Whatever is easy is not valuable, therefore it's not good. What is difficult is not easy, that is valuable, and that is great. So when you read a really great work of literature or great work of scholarship, of criticism, the kind of satisfaction, the kind of intellectual gratification is really great, really. So I think that's very, very important. So whether it is East-West comparative study or any other comparative study, I think it's very important to have a solid grounds for comparison. Because comparative literature is often, can often be criticized by specialists. To say that, you just put two things together, you don't really go very deep, you don't really know this work so much. As a specialist, I know so much better than you do. And that's often the challenge to comparatists. So my answer to that is, I will become a better specialist than you. I know as much as you do, and I know another tradition you don't know. And this is where the comparatists become a better person, or better scholar. Not necessarily a better person, but a better scholar. Because you can talk to the specialists, you can talk to at least two different specialists, while the two different specialists cannot talk to each other. So the comparatives comes in between. And therefore, in-betweenness is where the comparatives always find themselves. And I think in-betweenness is a powerful position. So, but of course that requires a lot of work. It's not easy. It's much easier said than done.
I have several questions, but I would just propose one initial question regarding what, as you know well, we have even quoted Erich Auerbach has called figure interpretation, the topological interpretation.
Yes.
I think there is something fascinating about figure interpretation from a theoretical standpoint, also from our standpoint, let's say the American standpoint. The theoretical point is the change in the perception of time. Because in the figure interpretation, it is not the past which explains the future, which would be our present. It's the other way around. The past is figura, especially in the cases of the Old Testament, and the future, which would be the present, that is to say, Christ's advent becomes consummatio. And then it is actually the future event which necessarily gives the full meaning of the past one. And Abraham and Isaac and Christ.
Yeah.
And as you know, in the medieval ages, the figure interpretation was even further expanded. And it could also include pagan history. So there are several very keen interpretations of Homer that actually see Homer as figura and Christ as consumatio as well. So we have this full range.
Yeah.
The other scholars who have proposed that the figure interpretation collapsed in 1492, and a precise date, in October, when Columbus arrived in America, making a hermeneutical mistake, calling the inhabitants Indians, because he thought he was in India, which was purely a hermeneutical mistake, given his worldview, so forth and so on. But the true question was, you could not fit the peoples of America, what we would call later New World, to any possible passage in the scripture, be it the Old or the New Testament. And therefore, there was a collapse in the figure interpretation. Some scholars, as a Mexican historian called Edmundo Gorman, who wrote this brilliant essay called La Invención de América, the invention of America, he has proposed that Europe has become modern because the new land, the new peoples could not be fully understood through the figure interpretation. So I think this is a fascinating case for thinking the sort of methodology we are proposing, because then you have a sort of a new role to be attributed to the so-called New World, which goes much beyond fitting a European projection, but rather the other way around. The New World did not allow for the European projection to be true. So this would be one point. And perhaps you could find some ways to also think the Chinese case in these circumstances. The second point is that that would also allow us to read Jorge Luis Borges differently. And you have quoted Borges several times. Borges has this wonderful short story, which is also a fictional essay, called Kafka e sus precursores. Kafka and his precursors. And what Borges says is that literary history has always made a mistake. It is not that in order to understand Kafka, you have to read Heinrich von Kleist. It is actually that by reading Kafka for the first time, you can understand Heinrich von Kleist. So he turns upside down literary history, as the figure interpretation has done with the scheme of consumatio and figura. So I would be very intrigued to listen to you regarding this point. One, the fact that the figure interpretation that seemed so proper for understanding the relationship between the canonicity of texts, such as the Old and New Testament, such as Confucius' book of poetry, how it collapsed, supposedly, with the New World, because it could not fit at all any passage in the scriptures. And second, how would you see Borges and some other non-hegemonic authors, such as ours, actually playing consciously with this tradition, and playing consciously on the collapse of the very tradition?
That's fascinating questions. Really interesting. I think Auerbach wrote this famous essay, Figura, because he's Jewish. Because the difference between figura and allegory is very important. And also, it's not just only Jewish, it's also from the German tradition. And in 18th century, 19th century, there was, in German in particular tradition, there was big difference between different concepts, allegory and symbol. Allegory and symbol become very, very different. And the understanding of allegory became, particularly in German, you have the high criticism and therefore secular reading of the Bible and so on. So allegory is considered to be a very sort of shell of something. There's nothing inside. It's completely just an empty shell to sort of distort the text and saying something else, but has no relation with the text itself. So allegory is considered very simple and therefore is dismissed. And this condition, this began with, even with Kant and particularly with Schiller. So Gadamer's Truth and Method has a wonderful discussion of this historical passage. So with romantics, with the German romantics, symbol becomes something very different. Because actually allegorical and symbolic, when you think about this, are very similar. Symbolic also means a symbol like a cross. Every church you have a cross, and that is a symbol. And so the cross itself is meaningful as a cross, but also represents Jesus, and therefore represents Christianity. So that as a symbol is, what is a symbol as different from allegories? And symbol is itself meaningful as an image, as a concrete image. At the same time also symbolize something beyond its concrete image itself. So symbol becomes very closely related to poetry, metaphor, and because as I said, literature, poetry is always about particular things. But at the same time, they also symbolize something much larger. But then allegories understood as an empty sort of excuse to distort the text. So in a way, 19th century allegory was put down, and the symbol became very important. So symbolic. So in modern poetry, you have symbolism. You never have allegories. Because allegories is dismissed, but symbol is considered very, very important. And the most important thing about symbol is that itself is concrete image, is meaningful, but at the same time also has sort of transcendent meanings, bigger than or larger than the symbol itself. So in that sense, figure reading, when Auerbach was writing, is like the symbolic reading. So figure is like symbolic, because the allegorical is often dismissed, and they often identify or particularly from Christian allegorical reading of the Old Testament, it's actually reading the Old Testament as I said, already prefiguring the Christ, and empty its historical context. So for the Jews, when they read the Hebrew Bible, they read about King Solomon, King David. All this is very, very important figures. But for the Christians, are not that important, because what they are interested in is like figure like Isaac, which is minor figure in the story in the Old Testament, but for Christians become very important because you can relate Isaac, what he did, with Jesus. So, so in a way, allegory becomes identified with the Old Testament, and that's, I think, part of the reason why when Auerbach was writing the essay, he write about figure rather than allegory. And that is related to the whole movement of 19th century and early 20th to put down allegory as empty and make simple, meaningful, particularly for literary text. So I think that's one thing I can say. Another thing about Borges, Borges that wonderful essay, the precursors of Kafka. Actually mentioned a Chinese poet, Han Yu, a very important Tang Dynasty Chinese poet, as a precursor of Kafka, because Han Yu has an essay on the crocodile, and therefore he relates somehow with Kafka's metamorphosis, with this metamorphosis into a bug or something. It's quite interesting. Borges is a very wide-read, very knowledgeable person, and I really like Borges' work a lot. I think he's a writer. He is widely interested not only in European literature but also in other traditions. Particularly, he has a poem actually in which he claims, he says, "I am a Chinese." I don't remember the poem about Chinese War. I think Great War of China or something. He claimed he claimed himself to be a Chinese. So I never read Borges as somebody who dichotomized East and West. Therefore, yesterday when I talked about Foucault's quotation of the Borges essay was actually a distortion of what Borges was trying to do. Borges never said the Chinese encyclopedia represents different kinds of reading. He actually listed the Chinese, the fictional Chinese encyclopedia with Brockhaus, with Labous, with all this real Britannica, all these real encyclopedias of the West. So Borges, when he talked about Kafka and his precursors, he was reading literature in a very I think in a way, we can even say from a word literature point of view, he really was reading different works together. He even said that Lao Tzu, we can imagine Lao Tzu is the same author with some very different, I cannot remember the details, but he mentioned the Chinese Taoist philosopher, somebody, he wrote something company with Don Quixote or some other writers. So it's very interesting. So Borges, I think it's a phenomenon. His way of reading and his way of relating to different cultures, it's quite interesting. I mean, one of the most famous stories, the Forking Path, of the Garden of Forking Path.
Yeah.
That is also a wonderful text. Again, use Chinese as a spy for the Germans, and they're talking about a sinologist try to discover the incomprehensible novel manuscript in which time and space are completely messed up, right? But in a way, it's a very interesting kind of even postmodern in the sense of Latin American literature, postmodern of the imagination of the sense and space as mutable, as flexible, not in linear. Because in linear story, the story doesn't make sense because somebody died in chapter 3, but is alive in chapter 7. How can that happen? Because he's trying to sort of, that's what the forking paths are. The forking paths is different possibilities in time and in space. And that is wonderful imagination. I think that Borges is really very special in that.
Appropriate his question to ask you. Of course, this essay, as Zhang said, Borges e seus precursores, is an essay about not about somebody that Borges had read, but about authors that became different after you have read Borges.
Yes.
And let me ask you then one question. When there was, let's say, an inclusion of Western authors in the Chinese world, what was the change? And I think in the same way as Borges' essay, what was the change, if any, made in that world with the introduction of European authors, even authors that you know that were not read by Chinese because it was not possible in other times? You think there was any? If there was, what was that transformation, if there was any?
Well, in China, I think the big change of Chinese culture and tradition is 20th century. It's very late because the Chinese literary tradition, cultural tradition, the medium of expression, the writing, the script system, the classical literary Chinese, was used for thousands of years. Of course, there are changes and so on, but by and large, it's still the same kind of language. So from the beginning of Chinese culture, by which I mean we still can read the original of Confucius, of Lao Tzu, and many other pre-Qing philosophers who lived more than 2,000, 3,000 years ago. We can still read their texts in the original. This is something quite different in China from other traditions. But all this changed in 20th century. In Europe, if you think of the change, in Europe, the Renaissance was the beginning of the modern time, and that was the beginning also of modern languages. Dante was so important because he wrote his Commedia in Italian rather than in Latin. And therefore, every tradition would have the creation of an epic or tragedy in their national language. So in German, even though German has a Nibelungen lead, so Nibelungen is almost like a national epic. And then in English, for example, Fairy Queen, Edmund Spenser was trying to write an epic like that. So all the European countries would have their own national language. By writing an epic or a tragedy to prove that your language is as good as Latin or can compete with Italian, with Dante's Italian. And of course the French had long established that. The French are always very proud of their language. So basically the rise of the formation of modern nation states are often related to the emergence of a modern language in Europe. So in China, something similar was happening at the very beginning of the 20th century, because the Qing dynasty collapsed in 1911. In 1911 was revolution. The Qing was overthrown. The last imperial dynasty was overthrown, and then you have the Republican period. And very important in the maybe some of you have heard of the May 4th movement in China. Was a new cultural movement. And one of the things very important is to use the vernacular as the medium to write novels and communication, no longer the classical literary Chinese. And that was very, very big change. So in 20th century, in modern time, people use modern Chinese, which is very different from classical Chinese. So for young people, they have to learn the classical, spend some time and energy in order to be able to read the classical language. Some of the young people cannot read the classical Chinese, so it's very difficult. But that's very important. So modern, that's also the time that a lot of Western literature was translated into Chinese. In 20th century China, because China was defeated by the British in Opium Wars, was defeated by everybody, and had so many unequal treaties, and had some port cities were basically occupied by foreigners. They have the, what they call extraterritoriality, that is, they have their jurisdiction practiced in China, on Chinese soil, because they have the French, the Germans, the British, they all have their own parts. Shanghai, for example, is a wonderful city. Even today, you go to Shanghai, maybe the best preserved, beautiful part is the French quarters. Beautiful buildings and so on. So there are things like that. So China was a weak and poor country compared with their past. Chinese has a long history, has glories, but the glories were all past. In modern China, in the last 200 years, was a very weak and very poor country. And because of this, there's a need, there's a very strong sense that China needs to be modernized. And the modernization, of course, was Westernization. And in East Asia, of course, Japan was the first country to be modernized, because Japan was farther away from China. It's an island, so it's not directly contacted or connected with Chinese mainland. Korea was closer to China, was more influenced by Chinese. But Japanese, even though traditionally they were also influenced by the Chinese, they adopted the Chinese written language. Even today, in Japanese, you still use a lot of Chinese characters. So for me, even I don't read, if I don't speak Japanese, when I was in Tokyo, I can find my way around, no problem. So everywhere I can find this, read the signs in Chinese. But China was really very weak in 20th century. So there's tremendous desire to westernize, to modernize. So translation of Western literature is massive. So in China we have translated so many literary works. And also that influenced the writing of modern Chinese literature as different from classical Chinese literature. First of all, the language is different. Modern Chinese literature is written in modern Chinese, which is closer to the actual speech. Classical Chinese is much more elegant, much more classical, it's a very different language. And many of the genres, for example, novels, modern novels in China is more like Western novels. While classical Chinese novel, of course, novel also developed very early in China. The earliest great historical novel was written during the Yuan dynasty, the Mongolian dynasty, that is the 13th century. So it's earlier than Don Quixote and earlier than many of the other European novels. But it's written in a different form. It's kind of episodic. Different groups of stories can be independent to each other, not really a tightly connected, tightly structured novel. But modern novel is more like a Western novel. Therefore, Western influence is very obvious. So in that sense, I think Franco Moretti, even though I don't agree with everything he said, by and large, I think his model of modern novel as development from Europe to the other parts of the world is by and large has a lot of explanatory power. Even though I think it's not a complete picture. So 20th century modern Chinese literature basically was very much influenced by, first by Japanese. Japanese was influenced by the Western, and so there are a lot of, and also direct translation from the European languages, because English, French, German were all studied by the Chinese. Most of the Chinese intellectuals in modern history were studied either in Japan or in the US or in Europe. So a lot of students went to those countries and learned the languages. Where before that, even the end of 19th century, very few Chinese knew any foreign language. It's really amazing. I mean, just in 100 years, Chinese understanding of the West has increased so much. I can give you one example, because after the Opium War, China was pressured by the British, because there's a Tianjin Treaty. The British signed the treaty, the Zhang Equal Treaty, and one of the items in the treaty was telling the government of the Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty, to set up a college to train translators. Because at that time, the British were providing sort of very bad Chinese translation of their texts to the government of China, because Chinese government had nobody, a Qing dynasty, and nobody understood English or any other foreign language. And the British, because the Eastern Indian Company were doing business in Canton, in some of the port cities in China, particularly Canton, which is very close to Hong Kong. So there were some commodores, the people who traded with the British. They were not really very good in English or very good in Chinese, but they became the translators. But so the Chinese had to set up this interpreters college under the British pressure. But at the same time also, there was within the Chinese dynasty, Qing dynasty, within them, there was also the movement to learn about the West. So they set up this college also in order to know what the British were saying, because we'll be cheated by them, because whatever they say, we have to believe, because we cannot check. So the interpreters college was set up. I can't remember exactly the date, but 1860 something, or yeah, because Opium War was 1840s. So after that, the interpreters college was set up. And you can imagine in China, it was such a foreign thing, was never heard of in tradition for the history of more than 2,000, 3,000 years. And the next year, as soon as the college was set up, the college actually was headed by a missionary, an American. His name is P.S. Martin. Martin. The second year the college was set up, there was some disaster in China, natural disaster, maybe a drought. And then you have officials sending memorial to the emperor, saying, do you know why we are suffering from this terrible drought? Because heaven is punishing us. We ask foreigners to be our teachers. That's not a joke, it's seriously memorial sent to the emperor. And even more ridiculously, there is one memorial sent to the emperor saying that the British always cheat us. Because, in Chinese translation of the English is in ji li, like English. And of course, we call the British 英国人, in the first syllable, in, en. And somebody was so ignorant, saying, well, so far we only see the 英国人, the in people. We never see the G and Lish people. They must be cheating us. They didn't know English is one word. You see, it's that level of ignorance. But now in China, of course, we know so much about not just about English, but about the world, about the whole different countries and cultures. Really, I think because of this, because we are marginal, we are the peripheries, we have to understand the powerful center. I think that's true. I think we can relate this in Latin America as well. In Latin America, there's so many more translations than the English translation of Latin American works. So I think that's the same phenomenon. Because we are under pressure, we need to understand them, to know about them, rather than they have the need to understand us. But again, as I said, knowledge is power. We know more, therefore we become more powerful when it comes.
You're right.
You have just mentioned a point I have noticed too much. People in China say that they are nowadays studying as much as they can about the West. And what they want is to take the best of the West and to create, to develop methods of avoiding what is not good.
Yes.
Right? Taking into consideration that China is in a certain way choosing what's good and what is bad.
Yeah.
How can it be taken into literature, especially in the sense of censorship of what's written in the West? I mean, the translations of Western books that are made into Chinese, is there any kind of control, any kind of censorship that could be applied to these translations or to these books?
Yes, there has always been control and even censorship, depending on the time. Cultural Revolution, there was no translation at all. You know, Cultural Revolution, there was no book on. All the Chinese only read one book, the Chairman Mao's quotations. That's the only book that you are allowed to read. Not even Chinese own tradition. So there's no translation whatsoever. But right after the Cultural Revolution, in the 1980s in particular, China becomes very, very open, precisely because the complete self-closure during the Cultural Revolution. So 80s is probably a time more free than even today. So a lot of translation, a lot of introduction of new ideas and so on. Myself, for example, I was the first to introduce many of the Western literary theories into Chinese at that time. I was reading a lot of works, and I wrote, every month I published an essay on different schools of Western criticism, from new criticism to structuralist to post-structuralist, and later published as a book. And that became very, very influential in China, because that's the first introduction in the 1980s. And then, of course, during this time, there's always, I mean, China is a big country, very big. So even though there's government policies and all that, but you always find pockets of places that you can do certain things. You know, if you're not directly saying we have to overthrow the government, that's fine. You know, you can do a lot of things. So, but then of course there's different moments. Sometimes the title control sometimes is more relaxed, and therefore you have some books that you'll be surprised how much relaxation can be. Some of the works you could believe it's translated into Chinese, the word. But sometimes it becomes tighter control, and in recent time I think the control is tighter. But some years ago it was much more relaxed. So it's changes. Yeah.
Going back to the issue of symbols, allegories, and different readings of a text, you made some references to religious interpretations of certain texts that would not let people see other meanings and other possibilities. When you were talking to us about that in the beginning of your lecture today, especially when you referred to the Song of Solomon, that reminded me of 1977 Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon. Right? And it's interesting because most of the issues you were addressing made me remember, I mean, what critics and herself have mentioned about the book. Because although the book is dated 1977, it was decisive for her award of the Nobel Prize in 1993. And all the references she makes to biblical addresses, and her main issue was to address racism and basically internal racism. So, just a quote, if you could develop a little more of this, how these dialogues go on existing. And this was so influential on the African American community.
Yes.
Up to today, you see, Song of Solomon is a major reference to the African American.
Yes.
So that's, you were giving us the main points on this, so that's very...
But I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that work.
No,
actually.
I understand,
But-
but what you were saying is absolutely, we can refer to...
Yes.
Because
Well, of course, in modern literature, you find many great writers have a conversation with the
yes,
past great works.
postmodernist,
Yes.
yeah.
Immediately, I can think of the Italo Calvino's, his what is the novel, The City, basically in which he had a conversation with Marco Polo, 13th century, and of course discussed a lot of contemporary issues, but using Marco Polo as a as an interlocutor to talk about certain issues, and use some of the text in Marco Polo, because Marco Polo is the first one from Europe to go to China, go to the East, and so on. So that's one example I can think of. There are many other examples, and using, in a way, many of the postmodern works tend to kind of this, what we call cannibalism, that is to take from the tradition, from the important masterpieces of the past, and combine them and do something very innovative, and do paintings and novels and even movies, and become very, very interesting. It's, I think it's a particular Latin American genre of this kind of what we call cannibalism, use of the past, right, and creative reuse of the past, and address some of the contemporary issues. That's very, very interesting.
In Canada, about the definition of what literature, the East and West studies, and the importance of studying not only the similarities, but also the differences between literary objects from different cultures. I think it's relevant to say that in Northern and Longman ontologies, we find very little from Latin America. And when we find, it's very related to discovery of the new world. So what kind of community is being created by what literature?
You mean in the anthologies?
Northern and
Northern anthologies?
and Longman.
Longman anthologies, okay. Longman is edited by David Damrosch.
Yeah.
Northern anthology is Martin Puschler and some other people. Yeah. I think those anthologies basically reflect the American understanding of what they think the world literature should be, include some of the important works they think are important. I know that both Martin and David Damrosch are trying to do as best they can to include different works. So, for the, you say you find that in Latin America they're always talking about the discovery of the New World, became very important for them. That I don't know. I mean, I'm not familiar with that. So I think probably for the in the American context, in the American universities, it's very important for them to rethink the so-called discovery of the New World, Columbus, and the whole colonizing tradition. And they're very critical of this. For example, even there are people, Columbus Day was used to be a holiday, and now it's not a holiday. And some people are resentful to say why you celebrate Columbus' discovery of the New World, because that brought colonization and wiped out the native population and so on. So that is a very sort of, you find that very common in American context.
And your
So-
opinion, sorry.
Yeah, so maybe that's the reason why they have some texts chosen to reflect that.
How can we deal with that cross culture,
Mhm.
with the difference?
Yes. So by that you mean for example, in Brazil itself, you would have a different concept of what the great works are, but it's not represented by the Norton or Longman anthologies, right? Yeah, well, that's true. I find that also is true with many other, including Chinese literary works. You know, they have this sort of token representation. They choose some works, but definitely it's not the whole tradition, and not sometimes not even the major works we think are important. That's exactly why I try to really to argue for what I call the unknown, yet unknown world literature. Because many of the great works we know are very great in our tradition, but it's not widely circulating beyond its own culture. So that's why I argue we need more translation, not only translation, but also critical works, to argue for the canonicity of these great works, to say not only that's token as a token of respect, including those anthologies, but there are much more, and we should argue for why those works should be part of the world literature, part of the canon of world literature. This is what exactly I find is very important and needs to be done. It's not done. So I'm thinking of writing a book called The Yet Unknown World Literature.